So thank you very much. Very happy to be part of this conference. So I'm going to try to introduce like a bilateral generalization of the notion of logical grounding. So here's the program. So the first long section will be about motivating this view called logical grounding bilateralism, which like justifies adopting a bilateral view of logical grounding. Then I will describe a proof theory. I will describe truth maker semantics for the proof theory. I will allude to some possible applications that make this thing particularly interesting. And then Peter will take over about how to generalize that to other logics than classical logic. So my first task is to try to explain, motivate this idea of logical grounding bilateralism. So why should we go bilateral when it comes to logical grounding? So we just try to recap the basic idea of logical grounding, at least the way we understand it. And I think this understanding is kind of non-controversial. So the basic intuition is that some truths hold in virtue or because or are explained by other truths in a specific logical way. So for example, P and Q is true because P is true and Q is true. So this is the basic intuition, and there's a logical explanation between each part of the sentence, and there's the idea that the things that explain are in a sense more fundamental than the things that are being explained. So that's kind of what goes on with this idea of logical ground. So of course, so this idea of logical ground has already been studied in literature. So Fabrice Correa has a paper where he expresses the claims of logical ground by means of a sort of consequence operator that may be read as follows. So when you have like a set of sentences, a set of formulas on the left, the fact that they are all true logically grounds the fact that A is true. Francesca and other several co-authors has introduced another way to talk about logical grounding, which is meant, I hope I don't say anything wrong here, but which is meant to connect to the ideas of Bolzano on grounding. So it's a bit more complex in the sense that you need to take into account some robust conditions, and there's a specific focus on immediate grounding. But I guess the basic intuitions are kind of in the same family. So I hope everyone agrees there's a lot of common ground between those approaches. And so in this talk, I will, so of course, there are many distinctions you might make when you want to make a theory of logical grounding, full grounding or partial grounding, immediate versus immediate, strict, non-strict, or weak. For the purpose of this talk, I would only be concerned with the notion of strict full ground, which I think, I mean, you might take it as central, but I think for making the point I want to make, or we want to make about bilateralism, it's enough to focus on this one. And so you can distinguish 4 ingredients. If you want to analyze this notion, you have at least 4 ingredients. So of course, you need to have an entailment between the grounds and the grounding. So it has to preserve truth. Because we are concerned with full ground, everything has to be explanatory relevant. So all the members of gamma have to be explanatory relevant to the truth of A. They also have to be collectively sufficient to explain the truth of A, and they have to be more fundamental than A. And so if you look at the details at the accounts in the literature, it's not difficult to find things that cover each part of this analysis, although they will be presented or explained in a different way according to different accounts. So now I want to try to justify the move towards unilateralism, which is like tacitly the default view, towards bilateralism. So I guess one way to phrase the implicit unilateralism that is embedded in all these approaches is that only truths are apt to be logical grounds, and only truths are apt to be logically grounded. So when we are formulating claims of logical ground, it only involves truth. And of course, the move you make when you want to go bilateral is to try to generalize by including falsities. So this is one way to go bilateral, which is the alephic style, where you just include falsities in the mix. So you accept that truth and falsities are apt to be logical grounds. and truth and falsities are apt to be logically grounded. So that's one way to from generalization. There's another. So for example, the things you might want to say in that framework is things like not P is true in virtue of the falsity of P, which is kind of what makes these things attractive, because you have like a new way to talk about negation. But it also works for all the kinds of connectives. Like, for example, if you want to talk about material implication, P materially implies Q is false in virtue of the truth of P and the falsity of Q. So there are things that you can easily say in the bilateral framework that you cannot so easily say, at least not without including negations in the unilateral framework. There's also another way to think about logical grounding, which is further removed from the traditional or orthodox way, which is to bring in attitudes. So what grounding is about is not really about truth and falsity, but about acceptance and rejections. And this is more in line with other kinds of bilateralisms that are there in the literature. So what you have is like the rejection of P logical grounds the acceptance of not P, the acceptance of P, and the rejection of P logically grounds the rejection of if P then Q, and if then is introduced understood in the material implication sense. So this is the kind of two proposals I'll be discussing, and for most of what we say, it's kind of both are equivalent or work is equally well. For some applications, the attitudinal one works better. But what I want to defend is at first is that those two kinds of bilateral generalization at least make sense. So I suppose that the unilateralists will very early on or immediately make the following objection that, well, it's very nice formally, but grounding is a factive notion. It has always been thought and introduced that way. And by bringing this duality of truth and falsity, it looks like you are departing away from this very basic idea that grounding is factive. So here's a quotation from Bolzano, which is one of the main inspiration even into the modern literature on grounding. So he says, I claim that the terms of ground and consequence in their proper senses can only be applied to truth, whether these be individual truth or entire collections of them. And so this is like if you take that like literally or seriously, then logical ground bilateralism is just a non-starter. At least it's incoherent with the basic idea of grounding that is expressed here. But I think so. There's another way to cash out the intuition behind grounding factivity, which connects it not so much with truth, the truth of sentences, that with the notion of a fact. So here, in Fine's formulation of the factive versus non-factive opposition, he makes this disjunction, so such as a true statement or a fact. And so there's a way to, I think, to express the intuition behind the factivity of grounding, which is a bit more general, and which says that only what is the case is apt to ground, and only what is the case is apt to be grounded. And when you use that formulation, then it's not that obvious that the notion of bilateral logical grounding, especially the alethic one, is completely incoherent, because you might say, well, it's a fact that some things are true and that sentences are false. So if you only focus on like, if you ground truth and falsity, qua truth and falsity, when the things are actually true and actually false, you're kind of following at least the spirit of grounding factivity as it's expressed by the formulations I just gave. That is, you only ground what is the case by what is the case. So for example, it's a fact that 1 + 1 = 2 is true. It's a fact that 0 = 1 is false. And so when you say 0, what do you write? 0 is distinct from 1 is true because 0 = 1 is false. You say things that are compliant with factivity. This is one way to remove the whole lot of factivity. In the case of the attitudinal version of logical grounding bilateralism, it's even more, it's perhaps not sufficient to make that move. You might say, well, acceptance and rejections are attitudes toward contents, and they are not even like supposed to be factive attitudes. You can accept things that you might accept things that are false. You just have an incorrect attitude, but it's not like knowledge where you can only know things that are true. Therefore, acceptance and rejection are neither apt to ground nor to be grounded. And I think this is a fair objection from the standpoint of activity. So there are two possible replies to this. One is to say that actually, when we introduce acceptance and rejections in that grounding talk, they are meant to stand for correct acceptance and correct rejections, which means that they are taken by default to be factive attitudes. We don't just say it explicitly because it's implicitly it has to be implicitly understood in this way. And in that sense, it complies with the understanding of an even weaker understanding of activity, I guess, which says that you ground factive attitudes by factive attitudes. And perhaps there is a more even more bold move, which is to bite the bullet and say, well, when it comes to logical grounding, perhaps we have reason to say that logical grounding does not directly involve facts or factive entities, but more representational entities or attitudes, in such a way that the fact that those attitudes are true or false does not really matter. So this is a bold move. I guess there are arguments there that one could make. Perhaps this is very, very short, so I don't have to make the whole point there, but you might say, well, you know, there are some things that are usually taken not to be ground theoretically equivalent, but they are still factually equivalent. Like, for example, P and not P, for example. P grounds not P, logically grounds not P, but P does not logically ground P. Yet those things are factually equivalent, so it looks like logical grounding does not really care about facts. It cares about the content of representations, and perhaps whether those representations are true or false does not really matter, because the grounding explanations we make just are irrespective of the true values of the proposition. So this is controversial, but I guess those are the reasons that are there on the tables to motivate at least this kind of attitudinal logical bilateralism. So I think there are, so this is just to try to secure a kind of what can we mean, what can we coherently mean about logical grounding when we go bilateral in this way. Then there are some further arguments for motivating, assuming that this is coherent. Why should we do that? There's one argument by explanatory symmetry, which is to say that the kind of logical explanations that are provided by grounding claims, they can hold symmetrically when we apply them to truths or falsities. So when I say P and Q is true because P is true and Q is true, and when I say P implies Q is false because P is true and Q is false, it seems like the sense of because is the same in all those cases. So you have the same kinds of explanations. So why prefer the ones that connect only truths with the one that connect truths and perhaps also falsities or even just falsities? So it seems arbitrary after all to focus only on the explanations that connect truth. There's also an argument from explanatory power that is related to the issue of negation. So if you're a unilateralist, then you will have to treat like negative, like literals, simple negations that do not embed further connectives as primitive. Like the sky is gray now in Brussels, and the sky is not as gray right now in Brussels. They are kind of like on the par from the standpoint of grounding. Neither can be grounded on something more fundamental, according to the unilateralist view. But of course, on the bilateralist view, there's a difference. So this one can be grounded because it's a negation. Of course, if this is true, it will be grounded on the falsity of something else. But still, at least once you've accepted the coherence of the bilateralism of biological grounding, it looks like you have an explanatory advantage because you can explain more. So this is a second argument. So there's a final argument which perhaps not central to what usually people want to do when they do the theory of logical grounding, but which is kind of important to the motivation between the work we're doing here at Louvain. So I will spend some time on it, and also I think it's still an interesting question. So here's the thing. So I think, well, at least at the beginning of the work on logical grounding, like Fabrice and Francesca, I think it's fair to say that you focus mostly on the classical connectives, and then I know that Francesca moved away to discuss some other connectives like red quantification, for example. But so those are the basic grounding rules that were given in Fabrice's 2013 paper. And when you look at those rules, of course, as a classical logician, you say, well, they're completely fine. They kind of like respect the meaning of the classical connectives. But suppose now you change your mind about what is the one true logic, and you become an intuitionist. And then you say, well, this is perfectly acceptable. And suppose you change your mind again and you believe that case 3 is the right logic. And then you say, well, this is all acceptable, and LP the same, FD the same. So it looks like if you like those logics don't have arguably the same connectives, or the connectives have a different are different, like in LP don't have the same negation as in classical logic, same for FD, same for K-shift and for intuitionist logic, yet it seems like you need to accept the same like grounding principles. And so you kind of led to having the same theory of logical grounding for all those logics, even though they are different logics. So of course, I'm not sure that the main motivation for logical grounding was to have this like fine-grained to have fine-grained accounts, so that the logical grounding for classical logic should be different, significantly different from the logical grounding for intrinsic logic. But I think it's a fair requirement to say that, well, those are distinct logics, they have distinct connectives, so the way those things are logically grounded should be different. And it looks like in this unilateral framework, you don't have enough space to make those distinctions. And so the argument will be, once you introduce the grammar of bilateral logical grounding, you have enough space to make those distinctions. So it kind of motivates why we want our framework to cover classical logic, but also to extend to other non-classical logics. So now I'll move on and try to explain how we can formalize those ideas of logical grounding bilateralism. So actually there are 3 ways to do it. We started with this idea of underlining formulas, which has some advantages, but it's not the only way to do it, but I will start there. So suppose you start with a language L, it might be the language of classical propositional logic. Then you allow yourself to underline some formulas. So you have L underlined, which is all the formulas underlined, and dashed underlining covers formulas that may or may not be underlined. And so the positive grounding sequence, oh sorry, there's a line missing here. So the positive grounding sequence will be the ones where you have an underlined formula on the right, and those are the negative grounding sequence when the underlined formula is on the left. And I give you a couple examples and explain how to read them. So for example, this says that, so what is underlined is the grounding, so what is grounded, and the non-underlined formulas are the partial grounds that collectively form a full ground. And when they are on the left, they are interpreted as true, and when they are on the right, they are interpreted as false. So this says when P is, the fact that P is true and Q is true grounds the fact that P and Q is true. So this is like just like in the unilateral case. Here, how to read this? Well, the fact that P is false, the fact that P is false grounds the fact that P and Q is false. The fact that P is true grounds the fact that not P is false. The fact that P is true and Q is false grounds the fact that if P then Q is false. So so this representation has a disadvantage. So the disadvantage is that the value you give to the underlined formulas is kind of reversed to the value you give to the non-underlined formulas. So this is the disadvantage, but the advantage and the motivation for this is that it has a very simple subsumption rule, which is that by just removing the underlining, you turn from valid grounds grounding sequence to a classically valid sequence. So this is what you can observe there. Just remove the underlining and you substitute the triangle for the usual turnstile, and it works. And this is something that is useful, especially when you want to look at different logics, for example, non-classical logics. And here you can formulate grounding sequence that, by following this heuristic, will not be acceptable in those alternative non-classical logics. For example, double negation elimination should not be acceptable for logical grounding theories that is intuitionist. This can be seen as an expression of excluded middle, and it will not be accepted in K3 and FD. And this can be looked as a formulation of principle of non-contradiction, and it will not be accepted by the LP logician and the FD logician, even though it will be accepted by the intuitionist or the K3 logician. So this is the sense in which you get an expressive power when you go bilateral that allows you to make those distinctions between logical groundings for different non-classical logics. And so this is a key, this is a key advantage, I guess, of this bilateral approach. So this grammar raises some interpretational issues, some of which are actually common to the unilateral framework, and some of which are perhaps new. So of course, in the cases where you want to ground P and not P by the truth of P and the truth of not P, you have the problem. So what should we say? Should we say that P and not P is true in virtue of the fact that P is true and not P is true? Well, how can it be the case that P and not P be true at the same time? It looks like this formulation, which is still the official formulation that I gave, does not work. And it's not clear that it works better in the attitudinal case, because it will have to make sense of accepting both P and not P. Perhaps in this case, the attitudinal version is more easy to swallow than the alethically version, but still this is a problem. We also have cases which are perhaps more problematic for the attitudinal case, which are cases where you have the same formula on both sides. So if you read it athletically, it means the fact that P is true and the fact that it's false grounds P and not P. And if you read it in the attitudinal way, it means the fact that you accept P and the fact that you reject P grounds the fact that you accept P and not P. And of course, the question is, how could you both accept and reject the same proposition? And so I think the way so there are two moves facing those problems. One move is to have like a proof theory that actually cancels those things as invalid, because you want to stick to a literal reading of in virtue of the truth of. Another way is to relax your understanding of logical grounding and to turn to something like a subjunctive understanding of logical grounding, where you put your grounding claims in the subjunctive. So what this means is that where all the members of gamma true and all the members of delta false, then A will be true in virtue of the truth of all the members of gamma and all the members of delta. And you can make the same move in the negative case. And you can make the same move also for the attitude. Say, well, if we accepted all the members of gamma and we rejected all the members of delta, then we would accept alpha. Of course, in those tricky cases where you have like you're supposed to accept P and reject P at the same time, you will have like perhaps counterpossible conditionals to deal with, and to make things work, you would need to use non-vacuous counterpossibles. But I don't think this is such a big commitment from logical grounding theorists who are anyway committed to a certain kind of heavy hyperintentionality. So I don't think that the grounding theorists would be afraid of using non-vacuous counterpossibles. In any case, there are people who have been argued that grounding talk naturally commits you to non-vacuous counterpossibles. I have in mind a paper by Alastair Wilson that makes a point like this one. So if you think that this asymmetrical underlining is too weird and you want something more conventional, so there are two ways to make it more conventional, which is to have a signed consequence relation. So and bilateral assumptions. So you have bilateral assumptions is a set of assumptions and counter assumptions. So set of true, sets of falsities, or set of things you accept, set of things you reject. And this tells you, forces you to accept A or forces you to reject A. So the sign goes to the consequence relation. Or you can put the signs directly to the formulas. In that sense, you have only one consequence relation, but sign formulas. And then the sign on the formulas tells you whether they are accepted or rejected, or whether they are true or false, depending on your favorite interpretation. And of course, I think it's easy to see that all those notations are intertranslatable. It's mostly a matter of convenience, which one to choose. Depending on the applications, one is more convenient. Depending on also of the things you want to prove, some are more convenient than others. So I guess we have a grip on what we are trying to say with this bilateral theory of logical grounding, how we see it. And then I'm going to turn to describing a theory that tries to characterize, proof theoretically, the theory of bilateral logical grounding for classical logic. So I would describe a very minimal logic. So the only structural principle, so the one that will go into the pure logic of strictful logical ground, is a version of cut, which is supposed to express the transitivity of grounding. So for example, if something, assuming the truth of all the gammas and the truth of all the falsity of all the deltas ground A, and if A is one of the partial ground of something else, so here it's underlined because we don't know where exactly the groundie is, but we have one groundie somewhere else, then by just removing the A here and the A here, we'll still have a valid grounding sequence, because all the grounding work that these guys are doing to ground this, they will do to ground whatever is underlined here or in here. And here you have the symmetrical version. So next to this, structural principles, you have grounding axioms that play the role of basic grounding rules, basically, for the connectives. And I think it's easy to recognize each connective is correctly expressed by those axioms. So in the case of conjunction, you have three axioms. The falsity of A grounds the falsity of A and B. The falsity of B grounds the falsity of A and B. The joint truth of A and B grounds the falsity of A and B. In the case of disjunction, we go with the simplest way of doing it, which is to have A on its own grounds A or B, and B on its own ground A or B. We don't have A comma B grounds A or B. This is, we don't want to there's a variety of possible ways to describe disjunction. We go to the simplest here because we want to make a general point about bilateral grounding. I agree that there are other ways to express it, but they will be expressed in there's no particular difficulty. We're happy to add some further rules here if you think they are necessary for the case of disjunction. So what is nice about those rules, especially when it comes to the rules for negation, is that they respect two criteria that are usually thought desirable for people who want to improve theory generally, and especially improve theoretic semantics, which is that they are separable. So you ground one connective not by making assumptions about any other connectives. So for example, in the case of negation, you don't have separate grounding principles for the negations of conjunctions and negations of disjunctions, which is something you have in some, at least, unilateralist theories of grounding. And it's also analytic in the sense that the grounds are always proper subformulas of what they ground, which is, I think, a desirable thing from a proof theoretic perspective. And so there are things you can prove about the system. So one is that you have so even though you have cut principles, the cut is restricted by the scheme, the things of underlining. So you can still have a subformula property. It's a stronger version of the usual definition, which is, so what we have is that every formula that occurs in the proof is a subformula of the formula that is underlined in the conclusion of the sequence. So we have, so this is a particular version of the subformula property, which is usually taken to be desirable property in proof theory, especially when we do sequence calculi. Another thing that is interesting is that it's possible to, and it's related to that result, is that you can axiomatize it without use of cut. For this, you have to use a notion of non-strict ground. You have to mix the notion of strict ground with the notion of non-strict ground, and you have to formulate the basic grounding principles as rules instead of axioms. And you have to use a subsumption rule that moves from non-strict ground to strict ground. So it complicates things a bit, but then you can still have the cut rules for free. And also something that is nice about this system is that the rules for the connectives, they are actually copies of or at least very close, because there are issues with context, but they really mimic the rules, the introduction rules for the sequence calculus. It's just that you always underline the active formula. So you can see very nicely the correspondence between logical grounding and classical logic in this way. And of course, by adding further structural rules, you can recover classical logic, which kind of justifies the claim that JK characterizes logical grounding as the classical logician sees it. So basically, so there are various ways to do it. One which I find quite elegant is just to add some other cut rules where you cut non-underlined formulas. So it can be called ground cut, because you cut formulas that are grounds. You also can cut formulas when they are both groundies. So this may be seen as groundy cut. And just that will give you all you need to derive all the classical sequence. So here I've just gave an example of how to derive identity just by using those cuts. You have another example where you derive explosion, which is like a thing that you only get in classical logic. So this is how it works. Just checking time. I'm trying to go fast in the description of the semantics. So it's also possible to give a truth maker semantics for this system, which obviously has to be a non-standard truth maker semantics, because it's well known that in the traditional or in the truth maker semantics as it was proposed by Find, P, not P, P or P, P and P have the same exact verifiers and the same exact falsifiers. So if you only stick to this classical notion of exact verification, you will not be able to make the distinctions that you need, especially it will be hard to secure the fact that P grounds not P, but avoid the fact that P grounds P, which obviously we don't want, because grounding is irreflexive. So we have to find something different, and different things have been proposed in literature. So in Fabrice's paper on the impure logic of representational ground, I think he goes towards something more algebraic. Stefan Kramer has a very nice paper on ground theoretic content, where he solves that problem in a way which is closer to truth maker semantics by introducing modes of verification. The way we do it here is perhaps a bit more conservative in the sense that it's closer to the usual, the old Feynman way. The thing we need to add to make it work is to distinguish two kinds of verification. One which we call compositional verification, which is the usual one where a state exactly verifies a complex formula depending on the biological structure of the state and the logical composition of the formula. The original part is to have this notion of brute verification, where a state verifies a complex formula just like that, irrespective of the logical structure of the sentence and the melodical structure of S. So it's kind of verification by fiat or verification by divine intervention. So there are many ways to picture yourself this way of verifying sentences, but this is key to make it work. So the idea that, for example, S compositionally exactly verifies A and B in virtue of the fact that S is a fusion of T and U. T exactly verifies A and U exactly verifies B. So this is a usual way of looking at the verification of complex formulas. And in the brute case, you might have, in some models, you might have a state that exactly verifies A and B, even though it is merologically simple. And this is the key to secure the difference between, for example, P grants non-node P and P does not grant P. And the way to secure that is that because every state that brutally verifies P will compositionally verify non-node P, but it's not the case that every state that brutally verifies P will compositionally verify P. And so we, so this is the kind of basic intuition that makes it possible to have the required very fine-grained hyperintentional distinctions just by playing with this notion of brute exact verification. So of course, there is a detailed formal semantics for this, and I don't have much time, so I will skip. But the idea is that you just start with the usual state space, and then you have models that assign brute verifiers to all state, and they assign, that assign to each state a set of a sentence that they, it assigns to each sentence of the language a set of brute verifiers, not just to the propositional variables, to all the formulas of the language. And from those, you can build the compositional verifiers according to like the usual rules, except that as inputs, you take things that have compositional verifiers or brute verifiers, because you want grounding to be transitive. But this is just a generalization of Fine's approach. And then you define validity as follows. In the positive grounding case, so the truth of all the gammas and the falsities of all the deltas ground the truth of A, just in case if you take the fusion of all of a number of states such that for each formula in A, in gamma, you have a state that brutally verifies gamma, and for all formula in delta, sorry, you have a state that brutally falsifies that sentence. So you just take the fusion of all those things, and it will give you something that compositionally verifies A. And you do the same thing for the negative case. And so this definition is relative to a model, and you get validity proper when this holds in all the models. And so it's possible to prove that the calculus we described before is adequate relative to these semantics. So I very quickly describe some applications of, I don't have time to describe them in detail, but so one thing that actually is the way we got into this thing is that there is an easy connection between classical grounding and a certain approach to relevant entailment. So basically, by adding some further structural rules, you can move from the theory of classical logical grounding to a theory of classical relevance. So it will be interesting for people like Tennant or Peter, who published with Inge Dobal and Alexandra Samonek a paper on this in 2019. If you think of relevant entailment as a kind of restriction or filtering of the relevant instances of the classical entailments. And so, for example, disjunctive syllogism is a principle that is accepted by the classical relevant logicians, and it's something that you can derive by the addition of the structural rules that I just gave. Another thing, so it will require a complete different talk, is to say that, well, it looks like we have, so this way of having bilateral logical grounds for the connectives allows to express the meaning of the classical connectives as defined by conditions of positive grounding and conditions of negative grounding. So it gives like an environment in which to try to provide a proof theoretic semantic account of the meaning of classical connectives. Of course, a lot more needs to be said about this, but just like a suggestion for potential application. There are already proposals that are of bilateral proof semantics that are in the literature, like by Nissim Frances, I think. So this goes in the same direction. Also, there's possible to use this to defend a sort of like what characterize a sort of meaning invariant logical pluralism. So if you think at the case of the relevant logics that I described, they both are based on the same grounding sequence for the connectives, but they give two different logics. So Tennant, for example, who likes the one of those relevant logics, says, well, we have to choose between the two. I'm just simplifying a lot here, but they see them as like competitors, but you can say, no, they are not really competitors. They are just like two ways of giving a specification of the notion of logical consequence as true perturbation or as relevant entailment. And so you can say things like, we have a choice between two logics, which are different logics because they have different, like different they give you different consequence relations, but they still share the same meanings of the connective. So you can have, you're not forced to, so it's meaning invariant in the sense that you have different logics, but same meanings of the connective. And so you don't have to shift meanings because you shift logics, contrary to the Poignant view. So now I stop and I leave the remaining minutes to Peter, who's going to talk about the generalizations beyond classical logic. And I stop sharing.
Okay, let's switch. Do you now see my, no, probably not yet. Do you see my slides now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So well, I'll go very quickly because we want to leave some time for discussion, and Pierre said the most important thing. But of course, if you're going to capture the meaning of connectives in its grounds, in its theory of grounds, then it's like a logical step or a normal step to go look at other logics, what they do, what they give, if we're going to look at them from a grounding perspective. So then we came up with the notion of a constitution, which is a set of grounding sequence that like basic grounding statements that capture the meaning of the connectives involved. So this is an example for classical logic, and Pierre has been mentioning these statements, of course. These are not all the grounding statements, but like the basic ones. So it's not about embedded formulas or something somewhere, but just like the truth of A and the truth of B ground the truth of A and B, or the falsity of A grounds the falsity of A and B, for example. And so you can say, well, we capture now logics by means of their constitution, by means of their set of basic grounding statements. Like this one here is for classical logic. You might also define ones for other logics. And actually you can do this like very, in a kind of very permissible way. You can define, I will not give the definition of a constitution, but basically the idea is that the only requirement is that you get a well-founded relation of partial grounds on signed formulas, so on formulas with true or false. So yeah, I use here F and T, it should have been plus and minus, minus and plus to make it coherent with what came before. You have whatever statements like this, and together they have to be give you a well-founded relation on the signed formulas of partial logical grounds. And so you don't get kind of meaning that is circular or something, or meaning that is has infinitely regress. You always reduce to something that is semantically simpler, even though it might be syntactically more complex. And then you can capture a broad set of logics by means of a constitution. And all these logics get different kind of basic grounding statements. For example, here is one for the basic logic of formal inconsistency, MBC, for those who know this, which is the same as classical logic, except that the sort of non-contradiction grounding principle does not hold here. You need it adds something. So the falsity of not A is grounded in the truth of A and the consistency of A. This is the consistency operator that these logics have in specific. And for FDE, this is, for example, the ground, the theory of ground. You can have for K3 as here is given. So all these logics, like these constitutions, they kind of are the DNA of the meaning of the connectives in these logics. So this is the other notation. It's exactly the same thing, but then with the other notation, not the signed sequence. And then you can wonder, how do you get to the actual logic if you just have these constitutive sequence that, as we know, as we call them, the basic grounding principles? Well, we have to add certain rules like primitive identity, this mixed cut that Pierre was already talking about, a weakening rule, subsumption rule that says how you get from a sequence about grounding to a sequence about validity. So if you have, well, this sort of you obtain this sort of sequence, then you can get to gamma being the premises and delta being the conclusion. So if you have those principles, you can get to several kinds of consequence relations based just on these constitutions. So if you close it just a constitution under mixed cut, you get a theory of bilateral logical grounds. If you close it also under this primitive identity rule and the subsumption rule, I'll show them again here, then you get the notion of relevant entailment that is suitable for the specific logic. And if you then close it under also under the weakening rule, then in well-behaved cases, you already get the full original logic of truth preservation that you were giving the constitution of. But in specific cases, you will need identity and ground decut, logics that are not cut eliminable, and so on. It's a little bit technical, but it gives you like the flexibility to get to analyze a lot of existing logic in a completely different way, in a hyper-intentional way, by just reducing the meaning of the symbols to their constitutions. So very quickly conclusion. So we think that bilateral logical ground is a coherent concept. It has expressive advantages. It has explanatory advantages, and it has a number of interesting applications, like the ones that we mentioned: relevant entailment, meaning invariant logical pluralism, and proof theoretic semantics. You can make this much more broader. You can think of intentional connectives, how to give grounding rules for that one by, for example, embedding these grounding rules. So to say that A relevantly entailing B sort of is a ground for A relevantly entailing, relevantly implying B. So for if you want a relevant connective in your language, you could introduce it by means of this kind of constitutive sequence. But this is go far beyond. It would also be nice to develop this for quantified logic, for modal logics, and so on. There's the truth maker semantics that Pierre has given can be extended to all these alternative logics too, and can be a truth maker semantics for relevant logic in general. Well, relevantized logic, and not just for grounding. And then I will end to still have a little bit of time for discussion. I'm very sorry for running a bit out of time.